The imagination, Blake says, is not something that I might have, you might have, the artist has even more, someone like Blake has in great measure. That is another facet of this uncoupling, feeling cut off, stuck inside ourselves sensibility. No, the imagination has us. We exist always already in great flows of the divine imagination.
Good evening, rather good afternoon, and welcome to Harvard Divinity School. My name is Charles Stang. I have the great privilege of serving as the director for the Center for the Study of World Religions, which sits across the street at 42 Francis Avenue. Before I begin, I would like to thank my colleagues at the Center and at Harvard Divinity School who have helped make this special event possible. So welcome to the Braun Room in Schwartz Hall, where we are here to celebrate Mark Vernon's wonderful new book, Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Mark. I will introduce Mark properly in a moment. And I'm delighted that this event is a collaboration between the CSWR and the Wonderstruck podcast. I'd like to acknowledge Liz Bailey and Camilla Newman for helping facilitate this event. Thank you both so much. I'd also like to thank the whole Wonderstruck team, at the helm of which, of course, is my dear friend and collaborator, Elizabeth Rovere. Elizabeth is the host of the Wonderstruck podcast, which was, quote, inspired by the idea of being struck by the wrinkle in time, the glitch in the field, the liminal space filled with awe, the uncanny and wonder. Such experiences often give us goosebumps, as they don't fit into our everyday perceptual framework. Such events are related to questions about consciousness, being, and reality that harkens back insight, intuition, creativity, and discovery. We look at mystery as a place where transformation often occurs. Those are the words of Elizabeth describing this remarkable podcast. Wonderstruck now has nearly 30 episodes available, the latest of which is a conversation with Mark on the meaning crisis and rediscovering the sacred. A word about Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a clinical psychologist, a yoga teacher, a Harvard Divinity School alumna, and a member of the HDS Dean's Council. Her work is rooted in exploring deeper levels of understanding and knowing that transcend division, drawing on contemplative neuroscience, modern group analysis, mysticism, and esotericism. She engages in conversations that explore the metaphysical, the transcendent, and the expansive dimensions of human experience. She also serves on the faculty of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science, where she teaches contemplative reading, a practice that she believes fosters creativity and the recognition of deeper ways of knowing. And we will have a taste of that contemplative reading practice later from Elizabeth. She'll lead us in that after Mark introduces his book. So from the description I've given of Elizabeth and Wonderstruck, it should come as no surprise that we are friends and collaborators. Transcendental insurgents in what often feels like a repressive flatland in the contemporary humanities, including and sometimes especially even in the study of religion. She and I have each taken inspiration from Jeff Kripal's call for a super humanities, an insurgency I have tried to foster here at the Divinity School under the banner of transcendence and transformation. And thank you for always introducing me to such interesting and compelling people and books, like Mark here. But Mark is a London-based psychotherapist, writer, and a former Anglican priest. He's also a podcaster and a columnist with The Idler, and he speaks regularly at festivals and on the BBC. He has a PhD in philosophy and degrees also in theology and physics. Some of you may know Mark's work better than I do. After all, he's enormously prolific, writing on such diverse topics as William Blake, of course, but also Plato, Dante, and what he tantalizingly calls a secret history of Christianity, which foregrounds the evolution of consciousness. So clearly I have some more reading to do, but I've already been doing some of it. I finished Awake just this past week while I was traveling in Egypt. In fact, I spoke at a conference at a place called the New Hermopolis Center, which is in Middle Egypt, hard to reach. And at the New Hermopolis Center, each of the rooms is named after a luminary in the Hermetic tradition. Those of you who know me will not be surprised to know that I stayed in the Plotinus suite. But alongside Plotinus, there's rooms named after Ficino, Goethe, Ibn Arabi, Carl Jung, and of course, William Blake. So Mark, we need to get you to the New Hermopolis Center, and you need to stay in the William Blake suite. Elizabeth has met the remarkable founder of the New Hermopolis Center, Mervat Abdel Nasser. She spoke at a Wonderstruck symposium 2 summers ago. So I know you're all eager to hear from Mark, and I'm eager to put some questions to him. So here's how this afternoon will unfold. Mark will take the podium and introduce his new book. Then, as I mentioned, Elizabeth will lead us in a contemplative reading. And after that, Mark and I will start a dialogue into which we will invite you. Thank you again for coming out. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Wonderstruck. Thank you, Harvard Divinity School. And thank you, Mark.
Look, thank you so much. It's wonderful to come here, arrive, and to feel the depth already in the room, actually. And I want to join this insurgency. No small part of wanting to write the book in the way I did is because William Blake is one of these figures, a bit like I discovered with Dante when I was writing on Dante, that he can be studied in great depth. People can write whole books about him and barely mention the transcendent or the mystical or the religious. There's one very, very famous author who was the chair of the Blake Society, who apparently read the whole of Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, and his response was, "I didn't realize Jesus was in it." So it's amazing, actually. There's something very profound going on there, that these wonderful texts can be deeply appreciated by people and yet completely missed as well. And I think that's no small part, I'm sure, of why you guys are thinking of these things in this way. But another person who I want to consciously bring into the room, of course, is William Blake himself, and also the divine imagination, which we're going to talk about in part this afternoon. And so I thought I'd begin my few remarks actually with the opening sections from William Blake's great poem, Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, and lean into it and feel into it. And ask yourself, what's it calling forth? What am I getting? What am I not getting? What are the energetics? Because as Blake said, energy is eternal delight. And then I'll offer a few thoughts and comments. So this is how it begins. And William Blake opens the poem in his own words when he says, "Of the sleep of Ulro, and of the passage through eternal death, and of the awakening to eternal life. This theme calls me in sleep night after night, and every morn awakes me at sunrise. And I see the Saviour over me, spreading his beams of love and dictating the words of this mild song." So Blake often says that his poems are dictated. He then has to do the work of receiving whatever that dictation is saying. So there's always an active element when we receive these things. First clue about the divine imagination. But here's what he hears the dictator, the divine dictation saying to him. God says, "Awake, awake, O sleeper of the land of shadows. Wake, expand. I am in you and you in me, mutual in love divine. fibres of love from man to man through Albion's pleasant land, in all the dark Atlantic vale, down from the hills of Surrey, a black water accumulates. Return, Albion, return. Thy brethren call thee, and thy fathers and thy sons, thy nurses and thy mothers, thy sisters and thy daughters weep at thy soul's disease, and the divine vision is darkened. Thy emanation that was wont to play before thy face, beaming forth with her daughters into the divine bosom, where hast thou hidden thy emanation, lovely Jerusalem, from the vision and fruition of the Holy One? I'm not a God afar off. I'm a brother and friend. Within your bosoms I reside, and you reside in me. Lo, we are one, forgiving all evil, not seeking recompense. Ye are my members, O ye sleepers of Beulah, land of shades. But then Albion, whom the poem is about, replies, and this sort of sets up what then is going to unfold. Albion, the perturbed man, away turns down the valley's dark, saying, we are not one, we are many, thou most simulative phantom of the overheated brain. Next time you've seen a brain scan in a bit of religious studies, remember that Blake saw it 200 years ago. Thou most simulated phantom of the overheated brain, shadow of immortality, not really immortality, seeking to keep my soul a victim to thy love, which binds man, the enemy of man, into deceitful friendships. Jerusalem is not. Her daughters are indefinite. By demonstration, man alone can live, and not by faith. My mountains are my own, and I will keep them to myself. The Malvern and the Cheviot, the Wolds, Flin Limon and Snowdon are mine. Here will I build my laws of moral virtue. Humanity shall be no more, but war and princedom and victory. So spoke Albion in jealous fears, hiding his emanation from the Thames and Medway rivers of Beulah, dissembling his jealousy before the throne divine, darkening, cold. So this is some sense of where Blake felt the Georgian period in which he was born 200 years ago. So he's born 1757 and dies in 1827, the 200th anniversary coming up in a couple of years. And I think that he offers a spiritual analysis for his time that have become our times. And this is why he wants us to turn and reconsider the imagination as the way back to knowing Jerusalem, the emanation, once more, to knowing these truths about the divine imagination and rediscovering the connection that we have lost with ourselves, with the world around us, and with nature, and of course with the divine as well. And Blake, he lives in a time where deism is really taking hold. That's one way of getting into what he saw unfolding. So deism is the idea that the divine is like a great engineer and sets the ball rolling, but then, as Blake says, disappears behind the clouds, becomes a nobody. And the extraordinary thing about this is that it came about really because of an extraordinary achievement of the human imagination, particularly in the form and person of Isaac Newton. In the 18th century, you really can't overestimate the presence of Newton on the imaginations of particularly the natural philosophers who followed him, figures like John Locke, figures like Tom Paine, figures like Jeremy Bentham, figures even like Immanuel Kant. And what they saw Newton achieve was seeing this extraordinary symmetry, which, as we remember it now, that which causes an apple to fall from a tree is the same as that which causes the moon to spin around the earth. And this is an amazing achievement of the imagination to see that. But it had these dramatically unintended consequences, which is that it sparked this sort of obsession with finding laws everywhere, as if every part of the cosmos, human existence, even our inner lives, could similarly be tracked. And so you get John Locke coming up with the notion of the tabula rasa, and we receive sense data that are kind of stuck inside ourselves, jiggling around this sense data, maybe hallucinating out some kind of model of the world, but left uncoupled from others, not sharing in any kind of mutual reception of experience, but instead piecemeal, isolated. And that's still more or less the dominant model that obtains in psychology, in neuroscience. Morality too. This extraordinary thing happens in Blake's lifetime that two, not one but two new moral systems are invented. One in London, where I live, by Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism, and then the other in Prussia by the tremendous, extraordinary figure of Immanuel Kant, deontology. And both these systems codify morality, try to work out ways that you can not know yourself within the world, not have to navigate the love and the hate that runs through you, not have to know what might be drawing you towards what's good, beautiful and true, but instead either by sort of fiat, deontology, what you should and shouldn't do, or by calculation, the philosophic calculus of utilitarianism, working out what would bring the greatest for the greatest number, greatest happiness for the greatest number. This beds down, and Blake spots the consequence, because what it tends to do is isolate moral matters into issues and then divide people. Are you for or against? Is it good? Is it bad? Are you on my side or not? And I think this has amplified multiple times now, because we now are building our culture on a system that loves it when things are split, because it's a binary digital system. And so, as it were, we readied the world for the algorithm, and we're now feeling some of the consequences of that. And it goes back again to what was beginning to unfold in Blake's time. He calls it the wastes of moral law. It wastes life in this tragic way because it was designed to make life better. And then you can think about how this, has these knock-on effects in terms of the natural world. And Blake thinks a lot about what happens when we live from memory, because we become uncoupled. We live from a kind of inner life that's stuck in its own effort to generate a sense of vitality. And he talks about the daughters of memory pulling the fibres of love from the body of Albion. And Albion had known the Hermetic way, which was that the microcosm within was a reflection of a macrocosm without. And this has been undone now by this turn to memory, because the daughters of inspiration, as Blake also talks about, can no longer reach us. They're felt to be cut off. And if you work in psychotherapy, any kind of psychology, you'll know on a one-to-one basis that someone who's trapped in their memories is someone who is trapped and suffering. And I think this is now part of our wider culture as well. And it leaves us uncoupled from the sources of inspiration. So Blake, though, always has the sense that there's something important unfolding nonetheless in these times, that there is darkness, but the light can't be quenched by the darkness ultimately. And I think he felt there's a new kind of freedom emerging in the midst of this. And in particular, it's a freedom to engage with the imagination in a new way. The imagination, Blake says, is not something that I might have, you might have, the artist has even more, someone like Blake has in great measure. That is another facet of this uncoupling, feeling cut off, stuck inside ourselves sensibility. No, the imagination has us. We exist always already in great flows of the divine imagination. Think of it like this. I'm speaking to you now, and there's a bit of technology turning the sound waves I'm making in my mouth so that these vibrations fill the room. And if you had an oscilloscope, you'd be able to see those sound vibrations sort of waggling around on the screen. But you don't hear sound vibrations on the air. I hope you hear words that are carrying some kind of meaning. We are entering a whole world together through this. And that is the imagination, always already fully operative within us. If it wasn't the case, you wouldn't hear words, we wouldn't be sharing this experience. There would just be this kind of buzzing bloom, to slightly misquote William James. So the imagination has us, and this is what Blake wants us to realise, and to know that we collaborate with it. So this is the power of the imagination that he tries to communicate in what he has to say. Both his analysis, one of the things which I tried to very much to get across is that he's a very, very sharp thinker, but he's also a brilliant artist and poet, musician as well. Sadly, none of that survives, though you can hear it in the words that he writes. And the thing about his spiritual analysis of the times, therefore, is that what he diagnoses is at once an antidote. Because I hope you heard it even in those words, which are quite dark. The energetics of it is already calling you towards something that's half forgotten because of the power of the imagination that is always ready there, just to be turned towards and engaged once more. And so I thought I could just end my opening remarks by asking you to turn to this image. We had some of Blake's words, so let's just reflect a little moment as well on one of Blake's images, another hugely important part of what he wants to bring to us. And this is a very well-known image, of course, sometimes called Albion Rose, sometimes called Glad Day. And just have a look at it for a moment and get some sense immediately of what it might mean to you, just the starting point. There's energy there, there's this nude figure, a kind of openness, youthfulness, quite a calm face, but dancing almost on these rocks. And then, of course, this blaze of light. And if you are into art history at all, you might think, well, it's a bit like Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. And if you remember that image, it's the human figure surrounded by a square in a circle, squaring the circle, this motif that's often talked about in mystical texts where the human mind, imagination, thought, all that we are, can see to the horizons of our awareness, but somehow receive from over the horizons as well, from the divine presence, as if squaring the circle. But Blake's changed that somewhat. He has his figure at a jaunty angle, there's the dynamic stressed, and then there's this light. And light, like sound, like I just said about sound, is one of these things that we receive at multiple levels all the time, quite spontaneously. There is the light. I've been in the US for the past week and the sun has been shining all the time on beautiful trees, and so the physical light has been very, very present in my mind, enjoying that, the golds and the reds and so on. But it's quite spontaneous to say it looks glorious. It's absolutely marvellous, it's wonderful. And that's because the light is also inside us. This is the second level, a bit like hearing words, not just sound vibrations. We don't just hear wavelengths of light, we see wavelengths of light. We, as Blake says, see through the eyes, not just with the eyes. The sense perceptions become thresholds, portals, which when we actively engage with what we're receiving, opens up into a whole interiority as well. And so we quite spontaneously say, I had a light bulb moment, or the light went on inside, or even I felt lighter, somehow lifted. But then there's this interesting detail in the picture where I think it's unclear where this light is coming from. Is it coming from within the figure, within, say, their heart? Or is it coming from behind the figure, some sort of point at infinity? And I think Blake's deliberately built that ambiguity into the image because, as I said in the opening words, quoting from Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Divine Albion, God says, I'm not a God afar off, I'm a brother and a friend. I'm in you and you're in me, mutual in love divine. And so this is the uncreated light as well, the third kind of light, the ineffable light, this infinitesimally small point from which is emerging the infinite myriad of everything as well, as Dante sees it when he enters paradise. And that, I think, is the full, but just a taster image, even caught in this one picture that Blake invites us into, the full extent of the power of the divine imagination. That yes, it lights the world up for us. Yes, it brings our inner life. But we also know it as something that's given to us as much as what we give to it. We receive but what we give. And that is the pathway back to the mutual shared, but revived, renewed because of a new kind of freedom that might enter the world too, as we become collaborators with the divine imagination. Blake says, there's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. Notice those lovely images. It's about renovation and industry, activity, but the moment that Satan can't find, because Satan has the opaque, collapsed take on things. But if rightly placed, it will make all things new. Blake promises us. I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was really wonderful. So hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I am actually really, really happy to be here because I almost didn't get here. About 3.5 weeks ago, I got a concussion. I got hit in the head with a Yeti water bottle, which apparently is a phenomenon called being Yeti'd. And it happens a lot, unfortunately. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. It happens. It happens a lot to 7th graders at bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, with it happens like they're swinging around and it like bonks you in the head. So I'm really, really glad to be here. And it's kind of interesting in a way, this whole process of recovering from a concussion and what happens and what it has to do with the imagination. All of these interesting thoughts and literal experiences of going through my head. In fact, there's a way in which, I wondered if being hit in the head could possibly open up the doors of perception, as Blake talks about. And in fact, there's this really cool thing that happens. It's called, this didn't happen to me, so don't get too excited, but it's called sudden savant syndrome. I don't know if you've heard about it. But if you get hit in the head sometimes, you can wake up speaking Portuguese or playing the piano like prolifically. So I'm waiting for the latent onset. So, but literally, but in all seriousness, this experience of recovering from a concussion at first, which felt very daunting. I was told no devices for 2 weeks at least. You can't even, I'm told I'm not even allowed to read a book, not even listen to an audio book. And I was like, what am I gonna do? And it starts feeling very stressful. She's like, my neurologist is like, you can draw, you can write with your non-dominant hand. I'm like, great. You can go out into nature. I was like, okay, going out into nature, I can draw, okay. So the cool thing is it reminded me of Thoreau and Walden Pond and how it's kind of a lot of what he was doing. And, I remember reading Thoreau in high school and then most recently at a Harvard Divinity School. And people were talking about this passage where Thoreau sits in his doorway staring at the sun, or well, not directly at the sun, but sitting in the sun in a reverie for 4 hours. And, full disclosure, I'm like, what is he doing for what is this? Really, and now I've had the experience of like, oh, I get it. But I just have to, I will talk about Blake, and it is related, but I just have to read this to you for a second, because it's really striking. He says, sometimes in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise until noon, wrapped in a reverie. Okay, then something happens and he's reminded of the lapse of time. And then he says, I grew in those moments like corn in the night, which like grows like crazy at night, like Jack and the Beanstalk situation. And this is what was really meaningful. So this time was not time subtracted from my life, but so much over and above my usual allowance. And that, has been what's kind of happened to me. I have thousands of emails to deal with, but I feel like I've gained time. And it's been a real gift in this experience. And that takes me into Blake. And I think you all probably know that quote from Blake, infinity in a grain of sand, eternity in an hour. So we'll do some contemplative reading about that, but it's where, time isn't time. Doors of perception and experience and the realm of the imagination, and it starts to open things up in a way, in a religious experience and in a very meaningful recovery from concussion. So I'm actually pretty hopeful about the way in which the humanities can complement and work together with science from this experience. So contemplative reading is, I think, yes, we have some time to do a couple of readings, is an invitation for you all to just experience. It's about experiencing a text, being in it, seeing what resonates for you, what comes up, and what comes through. If you can allow yourself to just sort of let go of the normal patterns and ways of thinking. It's kind of like a meditative experience, but it's not exactly the same. But it is about kind of lowering the default thinking mode threshold. So if you'd all, I welcome you to close your eyes for this. I guess we don't need to turn the lights down, but if you close your eyes and feel, at least take notice of your feet being on the ground, and perhaps slow your breath a little bit as you breathe in and out. And if you will, notice your breath coming in through your heart as you inhale, breathing in calm and peace. And as you exhale, just releasing any kind of tension. So in the contemplative reading, I'm just going to read a poem for the first time without a prompt, and then I'm going to let it be in silence for about 20, 30 seconds. And then I'm going to give you a couple of prompts, and then I'll read it again. The first poem, Auguries of Innocence. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. As I read this again, notice what sensations or images arise. What words feel resonant? Where may you have glimpsed infinity in the ordinary or in a moment? To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. So I'm going to read the next poem, and I welcome you to keep your eyes closed if it feels comfortable for you. The next is a passage from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Again, it might feel familiar to you, but allow yourself to see again what words or images feel resonant and what comes up for you. I will end up reading it twice, and I will give you different prompts after the first reading. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. So, some prompts. What are the narrow chinks in your perception? What filters or habits or distractions might have I mistaken for truths? How would I see if the doors of perception were more open? If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. I'd like to just read one more. So this one is from Eternity. He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. All right. I think we're getting pulled into our next section, but thank you both.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that reading. That was wonderful. I'm so glad you were able to do it and that you were able to join us. Thank you. I've just come back from a long trip and have been battling with jet lag, so altered states of consciousness, welcome and unwelcome, is very much with me. I'm so glad that this event is happening today and not yesterday. Mark, so I'm new to Blake. I've read many of his sources, and I've read many of those influenced by Blake, but he's new to me, largely. And I really enjoyed your study as an introduction. For those of you who are also new to Blake, I would suggest that I can wholeheartedly recommend that it's an approachable first book on Blake. All right, here's my question for you. So throughout Blake's life, he enjoyed, or you might say he earned, what you call perceptual openness, including near constant visions of entities unseen by others, angels, spirits, demons, or perhaps better, daimons, what you call unexpected others, celestial visitors and ethereal helpers. Now this topic is very dear to my heart. I'm teaching a seminar right now on demons or daimons in ancient Greek philosophy and religion. Some students in that seminar are here. Not surprisingly, some contemporary flatlanders have sought to explain away Blake's visions as the result of his suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy or hyperphantasia. I was glad to see you question those reductive theories. But not every visionary is also a theorist of his own visions. He might report them, but refrain from theorizing them. And vice versa, someone might theorize visions, but refrain from reporting his own. I'm thinking here of Henri Corbin, the 20th century philosopher of religion, who was much influenced by Blake, whose entire career was devoted to excavating and explaining visionary traditions of Islamic theosophy, but apart from one youthful letter, largely refrained from writing down or sharing his own. But what about Blake? What about Blake's explanations for his visions, if any? What is his explanation for his visions? Or what is your explanation for his visions? You speak about our recovering an expansive or empowered imagination. Corbin insisted that the imagination was not a fictive faculty. It didn't make things up. Rather, it was a faculty of perception. That is, when trained and attuned, the imagination could perceive layers of reality that were more real than our empirical sense perception. So Corbin had a view, he had a theory as to what was at stake in our perceiving these other layers of reality. Did Blake have such a view, and do you?
Yeah, I think Blake definitely would be on Team Corbin, and Ibn Arabi indeed. I think he would agree with Ibn Arabi's remark that there's nothing false in the imagination. It can be wildly misunderstood, but it brings truth to us. And Blake, he was born with a spontaneous natural clairvoyance. That is reported from the earliest days. And he also was taken out of the kind of education that might take that away from him fairly early on as well. And he does say that quite explicitly, that's important. And one way of thinking about that is that he lives in these times when things were shifting but hadn't yet settled. So for example, one shift that was underway was the move from thinking that if you wanted the truth of it, you always, at least since the time of Plato and before, would have turned to what we would now call the subjective, the inner, the essence. You'd reflect on the presence of something. So the idea of objective truth would just not have made any kind of sense. Appearances shift, change, whatever. Mm-hmm. But that was shifting in Blake's time because of the success of Newton. And so the idea that, no, the reliable truth of something is objective, which requires you to step aside from it as much as possible. So he spots these changes, and what it does, I think, is it helps him to develop a theory, which is that there's a kind of in-between zone that this split has opened up. And he's very witty about it too, actually. There's lots of lovely anecdotes about Blake and how he might report. There's one, he goes to these soirees convened by the Bluestockings, these intelligent women that had these soirees. And there's one story that he sat down one evening next to a lady and turned to her and said, "Madam," and she said, "Sir," in that slightly Georgian way. "Have you ever seen a fairy?" And she said, "No, sir, I have not." And he said, "Neither had I until last night." And then he describes a fairy funeral. On another occasion, he was telling a story about having been looking over cornfields and suddenly sees this kind of angelic vision amidst the golds and the shifting light and so on. And he was telling this to someone else at a soiree, and she wanted to take her children to see this sight. It's kind of half term, it might keep them amused. And Blake turned to her and just tapped his forehead and sort of said, there's a whole kind of training, in a way, a kind of education that's required. It's not that, he's one of these people I think that would say, it's not that I see something more, I see exactly the same as everybody else, but I see more of it. It's partly this critique of the philosophy. I mean, one way of reading those lines that Elizabeth read to us, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite, is actually a critique of the philosophy of perception, which closes you off. It's kind of strange. You've always got to pay attention with Blake. Why does he say doors of perception?
Yes.
Why not windows of perception? Surely that's the more natural metaphor. But he says doors, I think, because he says, no, what should be windows have been turned into doors with this philosophy of perception, from John Locke and others. And that's what needs cleansing. And then we see everything as it is infinite. Now, these, poetry can be read at lots of levels, but there's always a kind of sharp critique as well. And then for myself, partly why this always makes sense to me is I work as a psychotherapist, and I worked in a psychiatric hospital for a while. And there you meet people who live in very florid kind of microcosms. And it can be sort of fascinating and disturbing and all sorts of things. But it's also, when you work psychotherapeutically with people, of course, you work for long periods of time, and it can become quite boring as well. And that is when the imagination has got trapped, and it's just sort of on repeat. Whereas when the imagination takes you somewhere, then you know that it's connecting with the imagination and that's the inside of the whole world. And I think that it's partly, my sense is, it's by their fruits, you shall know these things. Yes. And the point that it touches me is, in psychotherapy, we work a lot with what's called the transference and the countertransference, giving these fancy names. But essentially, it's like, what images are you getting when you're with this person? What feelings, what strangeness that you kind of sense is not your own, but is somehow being received. And as part of writing the book, I sort of did a bit of practical investigation. I know someone who sees angels, for example, and I profoundly respect her. And what she sees goes somewhere. It's not just a kind of private fancy. And so I spoke with various people like that and tried to connect up my experience to their experience and then to Blake's experience. But always hold open this temptation to diagnose, like you're saying, the hyperphantasia and so on. Mm-hmm. He says, I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. So, okay, I'm going to take him at his word. And there's a world that's already present, but that we can see too. Mm-hmm. That's I think, something. There's sometimes said that romanticism fails because it doesn't come of age. So, the romantic poets that come after Blake, they invoke tremendous feeling, and they can offer consolation and expression and so on. But where's the epistemology? Where's the kind of grounding in truth of this? This is sometimes the accusation. This Owen Barfield, who informed this book I wrote on Christianity, this was his great accusation. And I think Blake tackles that with this reflection, as you're saying. He does reflect. It's the seeing through and not with. He says, look, when you're looking at a window, you don't look at the glass and say, how wonderful, this smooth glass, beautifully cut, held in nice lead frames and so on. No, you look through the window. And yet we've got sort of stuck with this surface appearance. Yeah. I could say more, but anyway, sorry.
Thank you, Mark. No, that's wonderful. And I just want to say two things. One is that I really appreciated your treatment of the inversion of the meaning of subjective and objective in the late 18th century. That was very helpful. And also, for those of us who are parents, there was something really encouraging about Blake's parents. They made some crucial decisions that really supported this young, unique comet that came through their sky, including taking him out of regular schooling and putting him in a proper art school, as I recall.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that was I think so often feel like we make the wrong decisions parenting. I was really pleased for Blake's parents. All right, thank you, Mark. I want to now ask the question I thought I was going to ask first, because this remark comes early in your book. So you mentioned that Blake influenced American transcendentalism. And as you probably know, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are alumni of Harvard College, and Emerson is also an alumnus of this Divinity School, where in 1838, the building stone's throw from here, he gave his infamous address, which earned him the ire of the school, and he was not invited back for 30 years. To the school's shame. We're very happy to champion him now, but in 1838, the school was embarrassed by Emerson. Now, the Center for the Study of World Religions has just launched a new initiative to reimagine and reinvest and revive American transcendentalism as a living tradition. So I was very taken by this tantalizing remark. I did a little search, but not much. I'm wondering if you can tell us anything more about Blake's influence on our neighbors down the road.
I think the thing that Emerson spotted is that Blake was not crazy. This was the accusation that followed him in life, and he addresses quite explicitly too. He knew what craziness was. It was written about. One of his books that survives has his annotations where he reflects on a friend of his that did go crazy and the horrors of that. Blake certainly, he said, knew nervous fear. It's not a ticket to instant happiness being porous in this way at all. You have to work at it, and I do more or less go with the reports that only really in the last period of Blake's life did he and Catherine sort of find a kind of tranquility with all of this. But Emerson, he makes this remark in, I forget which one of his essays, but one of the better known ones, and he does say that Blake's genius needs to be recognized. Quite whether Emerson unpacks that more explicitly himself, I don't know. But I think the sense that what's born inside you isn't isolated and left inside you, must be a key part of it. But it is already a kind of echo or reflection of what's been born in others and all around you too. So there'd be some thread like that, I think, which could be developed.
I was happy to learn this morning when I was digging into this that a collection of 500 of Blake's drawings was donated by a Mrs. Emerson to the British Museum. She turns out to have married an Emerson, I think a grandson of Ralph Waldo, or a great-grandson who was the former dean of MIT. I thought it was in the Emerson family, but it turned out that they only can lay claim to it by marriage. But there is an Emerson-Blake connection. Nice. down through the generations, which I found interesting. And apparently Henry David Thoreau modeled a poem of his after a Blake poem. So there may be more to dig into. All right, let me move on in the interest of time, and I'm sure that there are people here who have questions too. I have two more questions I'm going to pose to you. So you remark that Blake hoped to rewild our humanity and to remake our relationship with nature. So I want to ask you about nature and supernature. How does the rewilding of our humanity and our renewing our relationship to nature, how does it relate to Blake's visionary project of empowered imagination, in which we come to see both what is natural and what is supernatural? And following Jeff Kripal, I think it's best to insist on a space between super and natural. The supernatural is not necessarily beyond nature, but it's beyond our present range of perception and understanding of nature. So in the case of Blake, I sense that he's well known as a visionary of the supernatural in the way we were just talking about: angels, fairies, demons, spirits. I'm curious about his imaginative perception of the natural, and to contrast him for a moment with Thoreau. It seems the opposite is the case. Thoreau's almost entirely enlisted on the side of the natural. Thoreau is, ironically, a transcendentalist, witness to immanence on this predominant view. But Thoreau's writings are also filled with encounters with the supernatural, unexpected others, as you put it, demons and godlings. I love that phrase that I think it's Francis Young who comes that James. So I'm wondering if you could help us understand the entangled efforts to see more of the natural and more of the supernatural. Do these efforts pull our imaginations in different directions, or are they aligned, and how?
So certainly aligned, and this dispute about is the supernatural other than nature, and the answer is no. Is where Blake would certainly be on that front. Jeff Kripal's account of the flip. Blake said that he was only ever once surprised by the appearance of a spook. He says that I only ever saw a ghost once, and that's quite a shocking thing to say, because you'd think he might see ghosts all the time. But I think what he's saying there is that it was only once where he'd withdrawn into himself, and then he says, I was walking past a stairwell, suddenly this ghost was coming careering down towards me, and I fled. And I think that was because he'd forgotten about dwelling in this in-between zone, and so it was caught him by surprise. And so he, in a way, experienced a flip moment only once. And I think perhaps that this sense, I do like the hyphen, because it makes us think what might connect the super and the natural. You know, the hyphen holds a sort of space there rather than just collapsing it all together as if it's all done and dusted. And that space, I think, is the in-between zone that Blake would have. I'll tell a bit of a story just to how this might show up in the natural world. I'm involved with an estate in Yorkshire called Broughton Hall or Broughton Sanctuary. And I was up there just a couple of weeks ago. And they have a beaver enclosure. So there's a few efforts in the UK to introduce beavers back into the wild. So you have to build an enclosure. And Kelly, who runs the rewilding project, it's called a rewilding project, took me to see the beaver enclosure. Incidentally, it was the beaver moon last night. The full moon was the beaver moon last night. I just suddenly thought of that. What was very remarkable was, and she said this to me, that there hadn't been beavers on this land for centuries, for 500 years or more. And yet, the minute the beavers arrived, they just sort of got to work. They started chopping down the trees, and within even a month or two, the whole landscape had changed. Water had returned, the undergrowth had thinned, the diversity of species and so on was very rapidly increasing. And she said to me, it was like the angels of the beavers arrived as well and administered the intelligence they needed in order to work the land. And I thought that was perfect. Blake could not have said it better. When you understand, what figures meant by daemons and so on, it's the living intelligence, the presence that has a kind of telos, that wants to bring from the potential into the actual. This is what the great writers on these things told us, and Kelly, who's a rewilding expert too, had sort of spontaneously intuited. So I felt that we saw the angels as well as we didn't even see the beavers actually because they were up in their lodge, but we sort of saw the angels.
You saw their fruits.
Yeah,
the fruits of their angels.
Yeah.
Well, I have one last question for you, Mark. Thank you. And this is a bit of a personal one. I hope you'll indulge me. So one of my favorite chapters in your book is chapter 11. It's called No Other Christianity. And in that chapter, you introduce the reader to Blake's ever-evolving Christian faith and his tension with the forms of Christianity that were available to him in the 18th and 19th century. I'm wondering if you could tell us what you find most compelling in Blake's evolving interpretation of Christianity. What does he see in this faith that resonates most deeply with you? Because if I'm not mistaken, like Emerson, you are a former member of the clergy. I was never ordained. Twice in my life I went through the process of discerning a call to the priesthood, like you as an Anglican, but in both cases I discerned that I was being called elsewhere. How has Blake helped you discern your own call, your own vocation as a healer, as a therapist, a writer, a philosopher, and if the name still fits, as a Christian?
Yeah, I do feel much more comfortable taking that name of Christian because of figures like William Blake. I live in South London, and Blake is our local mystic. I live in what he called the lovely hills of Camberwell. It's now completely built over. So he walked the streets and breathed the air. He saw the angels and the trees on Peckham Rye, where I go for a walk as well. And so his presence has been very much part of his education as well. And but you've always got to be active, Blake says, and so writing or reading, that's all part of it as well. But I think what he stands for is the kind of Christianity that speaks to me, but is hard to find, which would be called the mystical or the interior, maybe. There'd be few people in the Church of England who would say they're against that, but it's got to be a living tradition. It's got to be alive in the person in order that it can be communicated and transmitted. You can read books about it, but you very speedily read that the books about it on the whole quite boring because they're sort of saying the same kind of thing again and again. It's in the practice that it matters. So whilst certainly in the Church of England, in my experience anyway, it's very hard to find living traditions of contemplative practice, let alone ones that might reflect on what it would be to see an angel. Blake has is one of the figures I've turned to almost come to my rescue in that. Again, there's something tragic about it because churches like the Church of England do a tremendous amount of good and stand for something that's very important, but it's inclined to fall into this moral sphere.
Yes.
I think Christianity has become for many people a kind of moral creed, and you sense this when every so often you meet someone and you realize that their dominant moral feeling as a Christian is something like guilt, there's moments of joy, but that need to recover the inner life of Christianity. And of course, the challenge as a psychotherapist is not just my inner life and the inner life of people I might be working with, but how that can connect to the inner life of all things. I think this is one of the great challenges in the mental health space. It's like we're very good at helping people to sort of get another plate spinning in their heads, and if they're lucky they can kind of keep them spinning and not come crashing down, but it can just exacerbate this sense of isolation, even if people are able to get on better in life, which is good to do. So I think that movement out is absolutely desperately needed, and I feel on a bit of a mission with it, and hope that Blake, who people love, because they, phrases like to see a world in a grain of sand, you know what you want that. I mean, actually, the other phrase that, just to end on another sort of confessional note, that Elizabeth read out, he who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lived in eternity's sunrise. I read that when I was in my own psychotherapy, and I got very stuck. I had quite a traditional, several times a week kind of psychotherapy, and it showed me a lot about what had gone wrong, but got rather stuck with that. And then I heard that phrase, and I didn't know what it meant, but somehow it lit up something, and it became a bit of a lodestar to try and follow. That when there was an intimation of something that might be like that within me, that phrase, which was without me, it enabled me to sort of hold on to it and try and follow the light, as it were. So something like that.
Well said. I think that there's a great and tragic irony in the fact that Christian moralism sets itself up often as a skeptic or an antagonist to Christianity's own transcendent mystical dimensions and traditions. It's not going to serve Christianity well. Thank you for that snap, whoever that came from. Okay. Thank you, Laura. I think now is the time where we should move to Q&A. And what we are asking is if you would mind just stepping up to the mic so our team can capture your question. Please make your way up, and we look forward to this way. Oh, hey, Greg.
So I had a question about the imagination, and you said that you want the imagination to go somewhere. What discipline would Blake, or do you have, having read Blake, to keep the imagination to the degree that you've entered it from losing its direction, its telos, its going somewhere?
Yeah, brilliant question. One thought actually is to speak with someone else about what's going on inside your head. And that might be therapy, but I have a spiritual director, for example, someone I've been seeing for quite a long time, about every 8 weeks. And the speaking out often is part of that liberation. Because you hear yourself saying something that might be a bit boring to you, but then you hear yourself saying something that's, I hadn't quite thought of it like that. And so it becomes a different path. And then, of course, they will reflect back as well and offer resources. But I think also bringing together all that we are. And you get this in Blake, there's the imagery, there's the words, there was the music. And I think, too, another thing that can happen is that this splitting can occur even in spiritual practices, so like there can be a tremendous focus on the body that even feels like it's a bit anti-intellectual. Or there can be a great focus on the mind, but how does this become embodied? And so I think, the reading as well as the practices, and the speaking with others as well as the sitting on the cushion or whatever it might be that you do, that holistic approach is at least part of the response there.
Thank you so much for this. Like Professor Stang, I've tended to avoid Blake for reasons that I've never thought much about, but it's been great to have this introduction, and by coincidence, there's a wonderful show at the Yale Center of British Art of Blake's work, which I also saw, and so those who have not seen that exhibition, I highly recommend it. It's quite wonderful. I got stuck in the midst of the readings, which were beautiful, and dangerous though it may be to close one's eyes in the middle of the afternoon. I managed to stay conscious and thinking about the doors of perception and what you said about doors versus windows. I got to thinking about the chink and the cave and thinking about the camera obscura and thinking about Newton's optics and the way in which Blake might have been engaging with this whole notion of the perceptual apparatus. And then cleansing the doors of perception made me think about aperture. I mean, that's another dimension to doors versus windows, a larger opening. Of course, there's Plato's cave, too, and that notion of being trapped inside it. And I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on what role is played by a certain kind of aperture, a certain kind of opening that enables the perception of the infinite that Blake described.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, maybe to give Plato some more airtime, because in the so-called myth of the cave, there's a lot of details in it. It's not just one image, and one of the repeated details is that it takes courage to find your way out of the cave. The prisoner who can look around is fearful. And then they've got to move towards a burning flame that looks very dangerous. And then there's further steps that Plato describes in the myth. And so maybe that brings in another facet of this, maybe especially in flatland times, that various kinds of courage are required, and a certain kind of risk-taking as well, in order to move towards the chinks, move towards the apertures, and see that they open up, actually. They just look like chinks in the cavern from afar. So that's one thought. The other thought is my PhD supervisor, Angie Hobbs, some of her recent work has been on Newton and Ficino, actually, and the Renaissance Platonist. And Blake's probably a bit hard on Newton because it turns out very likely that Newton actually got the idea of this action at a distance that he called gravity from Ficino's work on daemons, the kind of particularly the figure of Eros that fills the cosmos, drawing things together. And so that'd be another facet of it, and a kind of risk-taking with the study of these things as well, you might say, and allowing yourself to follow what seemed like a footnote that maybe become quite a key. So that's another thought that I got from Angie. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to follow up on the nature question too. I work at a small place where we practice Goethean phenomenology of nature, which is idiosyncratic. But so using Goethe as one of these popular but also esoteric figures, but who strove to have a imaginative practice of science, right? So that there's this famous dialogue with Schiller where he draws the Urphanze and Schiller, the Kantian, says, no, that's an idea. And Goethe responds, well, then I'm fortunate to see ideas with my eyes. Speaking about something of the imagination. And so my question is something like I was thinking particularly these dialogues that you've been taking up with Rupert Sheldrake and engaging especially with the work of Owen Barfield, who saw in Goethe and the possibility of, whether or not Goethe is invoked, a regenerative, imaginative, natural science and what that might look like. So not so much the nature, supernature, but how do we take what we would call science and what would be the hopeful role for imagination in that. So as a general question, but especially coming out of your dialogues with Rupert, do you see that happening anywhere? Do you have any hopes or misgivings about what that might look like? Hopes especially would be nice.
Yeah. I mean, Goethe and Blake are contemporaries, but they don't. I mean, Blake might have known of Goethe, I suppose, but Goethe I don't think knew of Blake. It's a bit of a fantasy dinner party, but I think they were both quite cantankerous individuals as well, so they might not just have got on. But nonetheless, I think, Barfield, so Owen Barfield is this figure, one of the Inklings, great friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. Both Lewis and Tolkien said he was the real genius in the group, with all respect to Charles Williams, who was probably pretty similar as well. The link with Barfield and Goethe is Rudolf Steiner, because Barfield discovers his perception that, particularly for him, souls have words. Souls, if you like, words have soul. Words have soul, that they have a kind of inner energetics. And he discovered this when he had a period of depression and then read particularly Wordsworth, and he was sort of insightful enough not to try and work out what the poem was saying, but just stay purely with the energy, and it lit things up for him. And both Barfield and Steiner actually said that Blake anticipated what they were talking about, and so I guess what Goethe was talking about as well. I mean, maybe the Blake-Goethe thing is because they were both in some sort of response to the Enlightenment. And you talk about the seeing, and that I think is the key. That maybe if Steiner would say that is what enables Romanticism to come of age, that, as Blake would put it perhaps, that sense perceptions, when they're mediated by the active imagination, can become perceptions of truths, and spiritual perceptions, you might say. And Barfield actually spotted this in Blake's work. So, for example, when Blake says something like energy is eternal delight, Barfield spotted that that's not just a nice turn of phrase. It's saying something quite precise about energy, that it's not, as modern physics would define it, that which does work, as if it's this just sort of amorphous stuff that you can sort of push around a bit and it'll push other stuff around. It has a telos, it has a personality, maybe many different kinds of personality, different sorts of energetics have. But they all are a reflection of eternal delight. At the end of the day, they're all going in one direction, which is to enliven, to energize, to lift, levity, the old force that enables us to rise. So I feel like I'm rambling a bit now, but I want to very much say thanks for sort of bringing that into the room, and it sounds like you're saying it already, really, yeah.
Hi, so my question is inspired by the exhibit at Yale, Burning Bright, which I went to see last week. And the exhibit starts with two jewel-like books that Blake developed 30 years apart or so. They're called Gates to Paradise. The first one is for children, the last one is for the sexes. And each of them has engravings. The first one has maybe 17. And then when he went back to this book 30 years later, he added a few more. And the book is essentially intended to capture the journey of consciousness, life, human aspirations, and how it evolves over time. And the last few engravings that he added are more about kind of the intersection of hell and heaven on earth, the presence of Satan, and also kind of a very Gnostic kind of connection between female and male elements. And so my question is about your perspective on Blake's own expanded perception over time, and whether there are themes that you have seen surface and that are reflected in his work that capture his own evolution and awaken imagination.
Thank you. I'm hoping to go and see this exhibition at the end of this week, so I'm now doubly hopeful. Yeah, I mean, in one way, Blake, I think I'm trying to remember Isaiah Berlin's distinction. He's a hedgehog. He has like one big idea. Eternity's sunrise, how do we see it? And he develops it throughout his life in different ways. But I think partly because of the events of his life. So he lives through, the American War of Independence, and then the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars. He's born when the 7 Years' War is underway. So there's, 1 million people die in Europe as a result of the Napoleonic Wars and the threat of invasion and, very terrible times, slavery, of course. But I think that it's a time where, Blake, although he has this one idea at the beginning, he tries to respond more and more to what's unfolding as well. And actually the figure of Jesus, who's there from the beginning, but becomes more and more important, and particularly the stress on forgiveness. I know of no other gospel than the gospel of forgiveness. And when in Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, which Yale have the wonderful coloured copy of, when Albion and Jerusalem are at their worst, Jesus appears. And there's something about being at the worst that Blake realises is when Jesus appears and the divine presence returns. I think that you alluded to this, Charles, even right at the beginning. Blake, like great mystics, realised that much as the transcendent is almost imminent, so also the way down is the way up as well. And there's even an echo of that in He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise, because that is a giving all you have away. And then, eternity's sunrise comes to you. And even I don't know whether Blake knew about this, but in the medieval tradition, the relationship between Jesus and Lucifer, Satan, is very, very fascinating, because Lucifer is seen as the one who emptied himself involuntarily, and Jesus is seen as the one who emptied himself voluntarily. And so, like the Venus, the morning star at the minute, can be both Lucifer and Christ, as well as the Virgin, of course, as well. So these things are known to be very entangled. So I need to go and look again at these plates that you've mentioned that he adds and see whether there's anything in that. Yeah.
Well, that brings our dialogue to an end. Thank you all. First of all, thank you, Mark, for writing this book and coming and sharing it with us. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, Elizabeth, and the whole Wonderstruck team for making this event possible. Thank you again. We'll see you shortly.
Okay. Thanks, Charles. Thank you. That was really wonderful to do. Thank you.